So we get to talk about another iPad today, and this specific device is the iPad mini first generation. And I'm going to be honest, this iPad probably isn't worth it anymore, but it is a pretty important iPad. It was the first time we got a smaller iPad from Apple, and I was a huge fan of this iPad for sure. This wasn't the first time we got a smaller iPad, but this was the smallest iPad Apple made at the time. And even at this point back in 2012 when this iPad came out, a lot of people were still saying, hey, what's the point of an iPad? You should just a bigger iPhone. And this thing probably, the sales numbers I think weren't super crazy at that time. Maybe they were, but based off all the consensus and the rumor, but based off all the, public speaking and everything people were doing, they just weren't really buying an iPad. People weren't just really happy with the iPad mini as far as I can tell. It wasn't until the iPad mini 6 where iPads, started really switching up it wasn't until the iPad mini 6 recently where the mini lineup actually started looking a little bit better in my opinion. Now with the iPad mini on the front, you do have that 7.9-inch IPS panel, and the body pretty much stayed consistent up until last year, which is so crazy. This thing almost went a full 10 years without actually getting a redesign, and that made no sense to me at all. The 7.9-inch panel on this thing was the same as the iPad mini 2, 3, 4, and 5. That 5 just came out I think in 2019. So this thing had pretty much the same body for so many years, which made no sense to me. Now there was no Touch ID sensor on this thing, it was just a home button, which just told you okay. Quite a bit of bezel around it, but again it's nothing crazy and it's expected at this point. It came out in 2012. But it actually had a little bit less bezel around the sides of the panel compared to the other iPads like the iPad 2 and the iPad 3. So that was also another pretty cool thing that Apple did at this time. You also had a front-facing camera on this iPad as well, which nowadays seems pretty normal, but at that time was a pretty, sought-after thing, especially after the iPhone 4 and 4S came out in 2010 and 2011 respectively. Now on the bottom, we do have the lightning port, which is cool. We also have a headphone jack on this iPad as well, which is also really cool. And on the back, we have the full aluminum back on this iPad as well, which again is another big advantage for this thing. When you're getting this iPad, like I mentioned with pretty much all the other iPad videos I've done, Apple has never really made a cheap feeling iPad. All of their iPads have felt extremely premium, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. Apple has done a great job with their iPad lineup. With their iPhone lineup has also been really good, premium feeling devices across the board, and these iPads, the same exact thing as well. So in terms of the body, that pretty much covers it up. Now in terms of the camera, you guys already kind of know this thing had a 5 megapixel camera on the back, 1080p videos on it. It also had a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, and it's definitely not that great of a camera anymore, as you guys can probably tell. It's pretty much on par with maybe an iPhone 4, possibly, but the problem is with something like the iPad, mini 1, it's really not going to be lasting too much longer, and the iPad mini camera just really isn't that great. It was pretty outdated, I think, even when it first came out. But even now, it's just you can do a little bit with it here and there, but it is a pretty outdated camera. So that is a big thing to keep in mind. When you're getting an iPad like this, if you need it for the most basic things ever, then quite possibly this thing may be okay. This thing may be able to handle it, whatever you want to do with it, but it's a pretty outdated camera. So definitely keep that in mind. If you're expecting to get this iPad and you want to shoot actual YouTube videos, or you want to do anything even somewhat, good on this iPad, this camera is definitely not for you. However, if you need it for some basic apps here and there, I guess maybe it can handle it, but it wouldn't be my first choice for sure. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of pretty much the longevity of this iPad, it pretty much is already outdated, believe it or not. Again, this thing came out in 2012, but it had that Apple A5 chip inside of it, which was kind of already outdated at that point. So what I'll tell you is with this iPad, it's definitely not lasting any longer. It stopped iOS support on iOS 9, so it's already kind of outdated in that standpoint as well. Now, when you're getting an iPad like this, unless you're using it for something that you're actually planning on using every single day, you're really not going to be getting that great of an experience with this thing, and that's a problem. It's done getting software support, you're not getting any more features, and that's pretty much the main reason why I wouldn't recommend buying this iPad, is because it's pretty much already outdated, and that is pretty much the problem with this specific iPad. It's not really getting any more software updates, and I don't really need to talk about it for 50 minutes more, but that's a pretty crazy thing in my opinion. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. Now hitting on the performance side of things, this device has that Apple A5 chip inside of it with 512 megabytes of RAM. Now here's the thing about this iPad, it is pretty much outdated in terms of performance too. This thing, not only is it not getting any more software updates, but the performance chips that it has inside of it just really weren't that good in the beginning with. Now with this type of iPad, here's the thing. For very, very basic things, and what I mean by that is, if you're pretty much just trying to use an iPad pretty much for streaming videos and different things like that, then quite potentially this is going to be okay. That's really the only thing I could see this iPad being good for. is if you're streaming videos, if you're streaming things like that, then maybe this iPad will be okay. But the issue is when you have an iPad like the iPad mini 1, that you can't really do too much with it because the performance really isn't that good anymore. But also the chipset inside of it is already outdated because it's not getting any more software updates. So like I mentioned, that is kind of an issue with this type of iPad. You don't want to go and get this iPad and already have a very, very slow or very, poor performing device. And that's kind of what you're getting here. But I will tell you, when you have an iPad like this, you can't really do too much with it. If you're trying to go and, actually try to play games on this iPad, or if you're trying to go and, do some other crazier stuff with it, again, you're really not going to be getting that smooth of an experience. It's definitely not going to be that nice of an experience. And because a lot of the applications you want to go ahead and try to download on this thing are already outdated as well, it's just not going to be a pretty sight, in my opinion. You're much better off even getting like an iPad mini 2 would be a much better iPad than this. But even that wouldn't be that good of a choice in my opinion. The iPad mini 4 is like the lowest I would recommend, and even that one, the mini 5 is probably the best one. But this iPad, not that good of a performing iPad like I mentioned, and it definitely would be my first choice of an iPad I would recommend to people, even if you are on an extreme budget. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up in the performance side. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing actually has a 4,490 mAh battery, which was actually really good at that year. When it first came out, I actually remember hearing a lot about this iPad and the battery that it had inside of it. I did have an iPad mini 2 and the 3, and the battery lives on those were actually pretty good as well. But this iPad actually had a pretty decent sized battery at that time, which I actually think is pretty impressive. Now, again, it wouldn't be my first choice to go and, pick up this iPad and use it on an everyday basis. But I do think if you need to go and get an iPad, I think the battery life on this thing isn't bad. But the biggest thing to keep in mind with these iPads is that batteries degrade over time. Any battery that you have on any device is not going to be the same that you had it, last year or the year before. It's definitely going to go down. So the problem with that is, with something like the iPad mini, 1, it's already over at almost a 10-year-old device. And because of that, it's already pretty much going to have a very degraded battery when you pick it up. So not only is the performance and the software pretty much already outdated, but the battery size is degraded as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind on top of that. So ultimately what I can tell you about this iPad is I really would not recommend anybody to pick up this iPad anymore. It just really isn't worth it. Is it, good? Not really. It's not even a good iPad I would recommend. The only reason I would even recommend even buying an iPad is if you need an iPad to stream on. If you need an iPad to just go ahead and actually, just like play a video on or something like that, that you're not really, messing around with it too much, then maybe I would even that would be kind of like a long shot, because you would still have to like turn it on and download applications and different things like that. And because this iPad is only getting, older and older, a lot of those applications that you would normally use, like the YouTube app or like some other streaming apps, even though like Netflix, maybe you can't even download those anymore on this iPad, at its full updated, point as of now. Maybe you have to download a super older one. So again, that's another really big thing to keep in mind. So ultimately, I would just stay away from the iPad mini 1. The lowest I would recommend, like I mentioned, probably like the iPad mini 3 or iPad mini 4. But even then, the iPad mini 5 is that perfect iPad, and that is the one I would recommend more than anything else right now. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.